What's something very rare that people think is very common? Receiving CPR and surviving with good quality of life. One of my good friends had sudden cardiac arrest due to VFib. Was completely healthy and normal and suddenly dropped dead. CPR saved her life and she is back to normal, albeit with a defibrillator now implanted in her chest. I think this is the best case scenario. Photosensitive epilepsy. Only 3% of all epileptics are triggered by flashing lights, but it's what most people think of when you mention seizures. Turquoise. I'm beginning study to be a jewelsmith and apparently most of the turquoise on the planet has already been mined and used. What we use today is a stone called howlite that can visually imitate it. If it's real, it's likely hand mined from the few small mines remaining that have some left. Real turquoise is very expensive as a result. Edit, I goofed, real turquoise is harder than its imitation. It seems having two loving parents that treated you right is rare when you speak to people. Tourette syndrome. Well, Tourette is not that uncommon, but the swearing is the most extreme form and it's very uncommon. I've only met one person I know for sure was diagnosed with it. It was in middle school and also somewhat conveniently around the time Tourette's guy was popular on YouTube, so that's the only reason I was aware Tourette's was a thing. However, she just squeaked every few minutes, and after sitting behind her for a week or two I didn't even notice anymore. Thankfully she didn't get teased at all for it, and honestly my ADHD restless legs were probably a bigger distraction for anyone seated near us. I have Tourette's and I got bullied for it hard in middle school. I moved in high school and only got polite questions. Bullying is random and weird. As a kid who grew up in the 80s, quicksand. Grew up in the 90s and same. But then I was hired at my current job and quicksand was actually included in my hazard training. It turns out there is actually some quicksand at some of my job sites. All those hours of cartoons have prepared me for this. Grew up in the 2000s, quicksand and whirlpools were both classics when I was playing with my classmates. Don't forget the 300-foot waterfall on every river. Multi-million-dollar personal inconvenience lawsuits. You're not suing MCD for millions because your fries were cold. And, many times, these lawsuits that are personal inconvenience are actually intense lawsuits disguised as inconvenience by the company. One example of this is the woman who sued McDonald's for her coffee being too hot, which seems like an inconvenience, until you realize the coffee was so hot it burned her down to the bone. Yay, that hot coffee case was so misunderstood. The lady had some pretty terrible injuries and even offered to settle for medical bills only. But she was vilified as a poster child for frivolous lawsuits. She was awarded the much higher payout because there was real negligence on the part of MCD and resulted in changes to standard practice at all fast food places designed to protect consumers. But the damage was done and a lot of people walked away with incorrect belief that you can sue and win for minor issues in the US. You see ignorant people in videos who immediately go to the "I'll sue you" threat for the most minor issues. She was also the passenger, and when they spilled it they were parked in the McDonald's parking lot checking their food before getting back on the road. She asked for her $20,000 medical bills to be covered because she was on Social Security. McDonald's offered a few $100s in compensation for skin grafts to her genitals. The jury originally awarded her 2 days of McDonald's coffee sales in punitive damages, which the judge massively reduced later. She ended up getting hundreds of thousands, not millions. She was awarded damages in the first place because there had been a pattern of McDonald's having unsafe practices and either settling out of court or barely winning the cases. Massively successful disinformation campaign by the McDonald's defense team. Blimps. Therese only 13 in the whole world and only 11 are functional. Edit, correction, there are 25 and about 13 are used. That just blew my mind. I googled it and there are about 25 in the world and half are actually used. I live in an area where I drive by a docked one every so often and usually just think, oh cool, there's a blimp. I've never thought, I'm seeing 4% of all blimps in the universe right now. Child abductions by strangers. Growing up in the 80s we were taught that if you were by yourself you were liable to be snatched up by a stranger. The reality is most abductions are by people the child knows. Stranger abductions make the news and often end tragically, but they're relatively rare. That is why you should never talk to your family, only strangers. Never get into a familiar vehicle, only ones driven by strangers. After all those years of stop, drop and roll, I've not been on fire once. I have and it works. There was a lot more swearing than those drills would have led you to believe. Can confirm, have been on fire, and were it not for stop, drop, and roll in my childhood, I would have definitely just kept running in circles shouting obscenities. It sounds stupid and obvious, literally until you are on fire and the only thing you can think is fire, fire, I'm on fire, and then a faint memory pops up and saves your life. Funny story, when I was in elementary school, two of my best friends and I had a backyard campfire. The fire was dwindling, so one of my friends thought it would be a great idea to fill a coffee mug with gasoline and pour it over the fire. This resulted in a huge fireball that rained little chunks of fire all around us. In our shock, we focused mostly on patting out the fireballs that fell on our tent and grass until I look at my friend and noticed that his arm was on fire. He didn't even notice right away because he was too focused on stomping out the other fires. Once we told him he was on fire, his natural reaction was to run around screaming, "I'm on fire, I'm on fire." We had to grab him and push him to the ground so that we could suffocate the fire. Thankfully he was not hurt, but for the next few weeks my other friend would randomly draw pictures of him on fire with bubble captions saying, "I'm on fire, I'm on fire." Yup, like I said, when you're on fire, stop, drop, and roll is far from at the top of your mind. "I'm on fire" is pretty much it. I'm glad the faint memory of the stupid song from first grade bubbled up somewhere in my subconscious. Being bitten by any venomous creature in Australia. Everyone who comes to Australia is scared of the animals but forgets the real final boss, the sun. Real talk though. Melanoma kills thousands of people in Australia every year, whereas venomous animals kill dozens. In 2017, the death toll due to melanoma was about 1770. Venomous animals was 19. Wear your sunscreen, people. Intentionally tainted Halloween candy. Remember growing up, some kids couldn't trick or treat because their parents feared psychos who poisoned the candy or slipped razor blades into the Tootsie Rolls or whatever? Yeah, as far as I can determine, it's a myth and never happens. If it did, think about how easy it would be to trace and capture said person. I believe there has only ever been one confirmed case of poisoned candy, and it was a relative of the child who tainted the candy, and specifically just for that kid. It was the dad, and he was trying to cash out life insurance on his kids. This is the case. It was in Houston in the 1970s. He killed his 8-year-old son for the life insurance. But was found out, given the death penalty, and executed about 10 years later. Texas death row was an even greater misery back then than it is now, and he had 10 years of it, then executed, so he definitely paid a price. https://n.wikipedia.org Ronald Clark %27 Brian #text Ronald %20 Clark %20 O''Brian %20 October A %20 Trick %20 or %20 Treat %20 Outing. For some reason the story became a sort of urban legend of disturbed people passing out poison Halloween candy to kids. Being aware, waking up under general anesthesia. Most stories of this are MAC anesthetics, where the patient is kept light and generally doesn't remember, but it isn't truly general anesthetic. If people really wake up under general anesthesia, they will have their eyes taped shut and a breathing tube in. They will also likely be paralyzed. It does happen, but it is extremely rare. Would also add to this, that friend who really did wake up, probably remembers the early part of waking up. Depending on the surgery and anesthetic, this may include still having a tube in, probably an ulna, and the people holding them down were actually trying to stop them from pulling out tube strips. OCD. I like this one. It bothers me endlessly when people say things like "I'm so OCD" because they like their desk to look neat. Genuine OCD affects something like 1 to 2% of people and is a devastating disorder. Teresa subtype about germ obsessions, which people often think of, maybe because of that show Monk, but it can take many forms people aren't aware of, which are incredibly distressing. Things like intense fear of harming someone, or offending God, which lead to repetitive and time-consuming rituals. People know they're being unreasonable on some level but can't stop themselves. It gets even more confusing that Therese also OCP'd, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, that differs in its presentation despite sharing a similar name. I had a manager once with OCD. The visible difference between what people think and what it is kind of staggering. It's crippling, not quirky. If I have encountered more than one person with OCD, then they had it well under control. The only person I've ever met who I could comfortably say had OCD was a customer who came into the shop I work in a few months ago. He came in late in the evening midweek when there was hardly anyone around. That might not be relevant, but if I was contending with such a disorder, that's when I'd shop too. It makes sense. Every movement he made seemed so careful and thought out and precise. He folded and refolded an empty shopping bag 3 times while I rang up his items on the register. This and other little quirks which mightn't generally amount to much, all came together to really give the impression of someone who was struggling with something and working very hard to be careful to keep that something under control. As an aside, he was also very mannerly, but that is probably just him as a person rather than relating to his possible OCD. If you moved an item on my manager's desk 2 millimeters while he was away, he would walk in, freeze, start sweating, he could tell something was off, and he would spend 20 minutes figuring out what it was. Go through his routine setting everything just so. This was, in fact, how our largest customer would leave him a note that he had been in to see us. That customer seems like an asshole.